Hi, I'm Pam Damour, the Decorating Diva. Thank you for joining me. I'm going to show you one of my best kept secrets in sewing. I do all of my piping, all of my ruffles, all of my trims cut on the bias. So I'm going to share with you how I make my continuous bias. It's really fun. By continuous bias, I mean we're going to sew the fabric in a tube, so all of the bias is going to be put in a continuous form. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to measure my fabric. So I lay my tape measure on my piece of fabric, and this measures 22 inches this way, and this way it measures about 18.5. So we're going to take an inch off in each direction for seam allowance. So I'm going to say 21 times 17.5 equals. So that's the total amount of square inches here. I'm going to make 2-inch bias, so I'm going to divide that by 2, and that comes up to 183. Divide that by 36, and that's going to give me my yardage. So I'm going to get a little over 5 yards, all right, from this little piece of fabric. Doesn't seem possible, but let's go for it and see. So first thing I'm going to do is fold the corner over, and I purposely cut this as a rectangle, not a square, because a lot of people don't know how to do it using a rectangle. And you don't go corner to corner like this, because that wouldn't be a true bias. You want it on a true bias. So you're just going to line up these edges, and you don't want to cut off this little piece here. That's part of your math, so don't cut it off. There's a misconception in sewing and even in quilting that when you cut strips of fabric on the bias, it takes more fabric to cut it than on the straight grain. But honestly, how can a 2-inch strip of fabric be more than a 2-inch strip of fabric? If you're using this method, it is the same math. So I'm going to cut on the fold here. I'm going to bring it back to where it was, and then I'm going to walk it to the other side. Walk it over, walk it over, walk it over, and now can you see I have a parallelogram? Okay. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to fold this over so that right sides are together, and I'm going to sew this part right here with a 1/2-inch seam allowance. I'm going to press this seam open and flat. Now, there's lots of directions that show how to do this, and often they'll have you draw lines for stitching. And you can certainly do that, but I like to make the tube first, and then if I'm going to draw lines, I draw my lines after. So the next thing I need to do is do a snippet that is the width of my fabric. So I'm going to do this 2 inches wide because I'm going to make piping or something like that. That's my most common size. My little trick is when I look at my index finger, from this line on the inside of my knuckle to the end of my nail, it's just shy of 2 inches. So if I snip just a little bit bigger than my nail, that's going to be pretty close to 2 inches. So let's give it a little look-see here. What do you think? Doesn't have to be exact because we're making piping. It doesn't have to be super exact. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to trim this end off just a little bit here, just make sure that's a little more even. And now we are going to sew this straight grain edge right here. This is the bias grain. We're going to take this straight grain edge and we're going to sew it to this straight grain edge. Now they look like they don't fit together, okay? But you just have to trust me on this. And this corner is what I call a soft point, and this is a sharp point. So this straight grain edge and this straight grain edge go together, just like this. Okay? And now we're going to sew that, and we're going to overlap it about a 1/2 inch, and we're going to start sewing right in that V, right there. Okay? If you've never made continuous bias before, this is a great technique. You can make a lot of bias very quickly, very efficiently, and you do all the cutting in one step, all the sewing in one step, all the pressing in one step. And there's never that need to figure out, are these 2 points going to fit together, or am I sewing right side to right side? It's all going in the same direction. So that's good. And the other thing is, when you use that math formula, you're calculating almost to the inch how much you're going to make, and that's really, really exciting. Now you'll notice when I sewed this, this end is hanging off longer. That's good. You want that, because this end started longer because of this part that you cut off. And this piece right here that I just sewed, see, that makes a nice even edge there. So now we're going to take this tube and we're going to press the seam open. And you can see the seam goes kind of diagonally because those two edges didn't line up straight across. They were at an angle, so that's why the seam is at an angle. So that's good. When my daughter was little, she used to come into my drapery workroom and say to my staff, "Does anyone need bias? Does anyone need me to make piping? Does anyone need me to make cording?" She would go in and she would make continuous bias for my seamstresses and make cording, and that's how she would earn her spending money. So now we're just going to cut this. Now I could, if I wanted to, mark my 2-inch lines, but I've got this little built-in tape measure right on my finger, so I'm just going to cut, cut, cut. And you could use a rotary cutter if you wanted to, but if you use a rotary cutter to do this technique, what you're going to have to do is have a cutting mat that's small enough that it's going to go inside your tube, or a tube that's big enough to go around your cutting mat. Okay? And you're going to have to keep twirling your mat. And we're just going to cut. I want to make sure to cut all the way to the end of my blade of my shears, because that will keep my shears sharper longer. If you don't go all the way to the end, you will put a flat spot in them. So what did we say? We said 5.1 yards, which is about 5 yards and let's say about 4 inches or so. And depending on how accurately I cut this, that's going to make a difference on how accurate my formula comes out. So we'll take our tape measure and measure this out. But you can see I'm making a lot of bias rather quickly. This last little piece is going to be a little bit narrow, but that's okay. So let's measure. So let's see here. I've got 1 yard right here on my table. So here's 1 yard, 2 yards, 3 yards, 4 yards, 5 yards, and a little bit more. So there we are. And that's how you make continuous bias in a snap. So now I have all this bias that I can use to make piping for my pillows. I can do some sheared welting with it. I can make binding on my quilt. I can do anything I want with it because it's ready to go. To see more sewing tips and classes that I have to offer, join us at sewathomeclasses.com.